In the late 19th century, London's East End was a world apart from the glitz and glamour of the city's wealthy West End. The area known as Whitechapel in particular was a grim and squalid place, characterized by abject poverty, overcrowding, and a general sense of despair. It was against this bleak backdrop that the notorious Jack the Ripper murders took place, forever etching the name of Whitechapel into the annals of true crime history. As journalist W.T. Stead wrote in 1885, "The East End is a vast city, as famous in its way as the West End, but the way is a different way. It is the city of the disowned, the outcast, the disinherited." The year was 1888, and Queen Victoria had been on the throne for over half a century. London was the largest city in the world, with a population of over 5 million people. However, this vast population was not evenly distributed, and the East End was home to some of the city's poorest and most marginalized residents. Whitechapel, in particular, was a notorious slum, described by social reformer Charles Booth as the most dreadful spot in the whole of London. Booth's poverty map of London, published in 1889, coloured the streets of Whitechapel in black, indicating the lowest class, vicious, semi-criminal. The living conditions in Whitechapel were appalling. The area was a maze of narrow, winding streets and alleyways, lined with dilapidated tenement buildings and squalid lodging houses. Families of 10 or more would often be crammed into a single room, with no running water or proper sanitation. In 1883, the Reverend Samuel Barnett, a local clergyman, described the living conditions in Whitechapel as a disgrace to a Christian country. The streets were filthy, with open sewers and piles of rotting garbage attracting rats and other vermin. Disease was rampant, with outbreaks of cholera, typhoid and tuberculosis all too common. In 1866, a cholera outbreak in Whitechapel claimed over 5,000 lives. The people of Whitechapel were predominantly working class, with many employed in the area's notorious sweatshops and factories. Women in particular had few options for employment, and many were forced to turn to alternative means to make ends meet. In fact, it is estimated that there were over 1,200 ladies of the night working in Whitechapel at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. One of the most notorious areas for illicit activities was Dorset Street, dubbed the worst street in London by the police. It was here that Mary Kelly, the final confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper, lived and worked. The socio-economic conditions in Whitechapel were a reflection of the wider problems facing Victorian society. The Industrial Revolution had brought great wealth to some, but it had also created a vast underclass of poor and exploited workers. The gap between rich and poor was wider than ever, and the East End was a stark reminder of the human cost of this inequality. Social reformer Henry Mayhew, in his book London Labour and the London Poor, described the East End as a world within itself, a world that very few of us dare to explore, a world of poverty, misery and vice. The fact that the killer was able to prey on the most vulnerable members of society, and that the authorities seemed powerless to stop him, was a damning indictment of the social order of the time. As George Bernard Shaw wrote in a letter to the Star newspaper in 1888, "The more we look into the matter, the more we must feel that the Whitechapel murderer is only a particularly dramatic example of the way in which the present social system manufactures criminals." Despite the grim realities of life in Whitechapel, the area was not without its own unique culture and character. The streets were alive with the sounds of costermongers selling their wares, children playing, and music drifting from the many pubs and music halls. The 10 Bells pub, located on the corner of Commercial Street and Fournier Street, was a popular haunt for many of the Ripper's victims. The area was also home to a large immigrant population, with Irish, Jewish and Chinese communities, all contributing to the vibrant and diverse character of the East End. Petticoat Lane Market, located in the heart of Whitechapel, was a bustling hub of activity, with stalls selling everything from fresh produce to second-hand clothing. In the years following the murders, there were some efforts to address the social problems of the East End. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee was formed to patrol the streets and protect women from violence, while philanthropists such as Octavia Hill and Angela Burdett Coutts, worked to improve housing conditions in the area. However, progress was slow, and the East End remained a byword for poverty and deprivation well into the 20th century. Today, Whitechapel is a very different place than it was in 1888. The narrow, winding streets and dilapidated tenements have largely been replaced by modern buildings and busy thoroughfares. However, traces of the area's dark past can still be found, if you know where to look. The Ten Bells pub still stands on the corner of Commercial Street, while a plaque on Durward Street marks the spot where Mary Ann Nichols's body was discovered. And every year, on the anniversary of the murders, tourists and true crime enthusiasts flock to Whitechapel to retrace the steps of the Ripper and immerse themselves in the dark history of the East End. The Canonical Five, the tragic victims of Jack the Ripper. In the autumn of 1888, the streets of London's East End were gripped by terror as a series of brutal murders swept through the impoverished district of Whitechapel. The victims, all women, were found mutilated and disemboweled, their throats slit from ear to ear. The killer, who would come to be known as Jack the Ripper, targeted the most vulnerable members of society, ladies of the night who lived and worked in the squalid alleys and tenements of the East End. Over the course of just a few months, 5 women would fall victim to the Ripper's blade, their stories forever etched into the dark history of Victorian London. As the newspaper The Star reported on September 8, 1888, "The horror of the thing is beyond all description. The bodies were horribly mutilated, and the scene presented a ghastly and sickening spectacle." The first of the canonical 5 victims was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to her friends and family. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, her body was discovered in Bucks Row, a narrow cobblestoned street in the heart of Whitechapel. She had been savagely attacked, her throat slit and her abdomen ripped open, her intestines left draped over her shoulder. Polly was just 43 years old at the time of her death, a mother of 5 who had fallen on hard times and turned to unconventional means to make ends meet. Her murder sent shockwaves through the community as people began to realize that a dangerous killer was on the loose. The doctor who performed the post-mortem on Polly's body, Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, noted that the injuries were so severe that it was impossible to tell whether they had been caused by a knife or a sword. Just over a week later, on September 8th, the body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, a mere stone's throw from the bustling commercial district of Spitalfields. Like Polly Nichols, Annie had been brutally murdered, her throat slit and her abdomen torn open, her intestines removed and placed near her feet. She was 47 years old, a widow who had struggled with alcoholism and poverty in the years following her husband's death. Her murder sparked a wave of panic in the East End as residents began to fear for their safety, and the police came under increasing pressure to catch the killer. The inquest into Annie's death heard testimony from a witness named Elizabeth Long, who claimed to have seen Annie talking to a man in the early hours of the morning on the day she was murdered. According to Long, the man was about 5 inches tall, with a dark complexion and a shabby genteel appearance. The next victim, Elizabeth Stride, was found on September 30th in Dutfield's Yard, a narrow, dimly lit alleyway off Burner Street. Her body was discovered by a steward from the nearby International Working Men's Educational Club, who initially mistook her for a drunk sleeping off a bender. Upon closer inspection, however, he realized that she had been murdered, her throat slit from ear to ear. Elizabeth, known as Long Liz to her friends, was a 45-year-old Swedish immigrant who had fallen on hard times and turned to the streets to support herself. Her murder was particularly shocking because it occurred just 45 minutes before the discovery of the next victim, leading many to speculate that the Ripper had struck twice in one night. Some researchers have suggested that Elizabeth may not have been a victim of Jack the Ripper at all, but rather of a different killer entirely. However, the similarities between her murder and those of the other canonical 5 victims have led most experts to include her in the Ripper's tally. That next victim was Catherine Eddowes, whose body was found in Mitre Square a small enclosed courtyard in the heart of the City of London. Catherine, who was 46 years old, had been savagely mutilated, her throat slit and her face and abdomen slashed and disfigured. A section of her intestines had been removed and draped over her shoulder, while her left kidney had been cut out and taken by the killer. The brutality of her murder, combined with the fact that it occurred just a short distance from a busy police station, left many wondering how the Ripper could have struck again without being caught. Catherine's murder also provided one of the most tantalizing clues in the Ripper case, a blood-stained piece of her apron which was found in a nearby doorway. The apron had been used by the killer to wipe his knife, and some experts believe that it may have contained traces of the Ripper's DNA. The final and most gruesome of the canonical 5 murders was that of Mary Jane Kelly, whose badly mutilated body was discovered on the morning of November 9th in her squalid room at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street. Mary, who was just 25 years old, had been brutally attacked, her face and body slashed and disfigured beyond recognition. Her throat had been slit down to the spine, and her abdomen had been ripped open, her organs removed and scattered around the room. The scene was so horrific that even hardened police officers were left shaken and disturbed. One officer, Inspector Frederick Aberline, later described the scene as the most horrific sight I have ever seen. Mary's murder was also notable for the fact that she was the only one of the canonical 5 victims to be killed indoors, suggesting that the Ripper may have been becoming more brazen and confident in his attacks. The murders of the canonical 5 victims were notable not only for their brutality, but also for the way in which they exposed the harsh realities of life in the East End. All of the women were ladies of the night, driven to sell their bodies by poverty, addiction, and desperation. They lived and worked in some of the most notorious and dangerous areas of Whitechapel, where violence and crime were a daily reality. As one contemporary newspaper put it, the victims of the Whitechapel murderer are women of the unfortunate class, who ply their trade in the dark and silent hours of the night in the narrow courts and alleys of the East End. The murders also highlighted the double standards of Victorian society, which condemned ladies of the night as immoral and depraved, while turning a blind eye to the men who exploited them. As the social reformer Josephine Butler wrote in 1888, the victims of the Whitechapel murderer are the victims also of a social system which makes certain trades the only means of livelihood for thousands of women. Scotland Yard's desperate hunt, the elusive Jack the Ripper. In the autumn of 1888, the streets of London's East End were gripped by terror as a series of brutal murders swept through the impoverished district of Whitechapel. Scotland Yard, the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, was tasked with bringing the murderer to justice, but the investigation would prove to be one of the most challenging and frustrating in the history of British policing. As the newspaper, The Star, reported on September 8, 1888, the horror and mystery of these murders are beyond anything in the wildest dreams of fiction. Leading the hunt for Jack the Ripper was Inspector Frederick Aberline, a seasoned detective with a reputation for tenacity and dedication. Aberline, who had joined the Metropolitan Police in 1863, was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his willingness to pursue every lead, no matter how seemingly insignificant. He was assisted by a team of detectives and uniformed officers who worked tirelessly to gather evidence and interview witnesses in the hopes of identifying the killer. One of Aberline's colleagues, Inspector Walter Andrews, later described him as a man of great energy and determination who never spared himself in the pursuit of duty. One of the first challenges faced by the police was the sheer scale of the investigation. Whitechapel was a densely populated area with a maze of narrow streets and alleyways that made it easy for the killer to escape detection. The police were also hampered by the lack of modern forensic techniques, which meant that they had to rely on more traditional methods of investigation, such as witness interviews and physical evidence. In a report to the Home Office in October 1888, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, noted that the district in which these murders have been committed is one of the most difficult in London for the police to work in, owing to the large number of courts and alleys and the consequent facility for the escape of criminals. Despite these challenges, the police made some early progress in the case. On September 30th, 1888, just hours after the murder of Elizabeth Stride, a piece of blood-stained apron was found in a doorway near the crime scene. The apron, which had been used by the killer to wipe his knife, was sent to the police laboratory for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. Some experts believe that the apron may have contained traces of the killer's DNA, but without modern testing methods, it was impossible to say for certain. The discovery of the apron was a significant breakthrough in the case, as it provided the first tangible evidence that the killer had been at the scene of the crime. Another key piece of evidence was a series of letters that were sent to the police and the media, purporting to be from the killer himself. The most famous of these was the "Dear Boss" letter, which was received by the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. The letter, which was signed Jack the Ripper, taunted the police for their inability to catch him and promised to kill again. While some experts believe that the letter was a hoax, others argue that it contained details that only the killer could have known. For example, the letter referred to the murder of Annie Chapman as the double event, a term that had not been used in the press at the time. The letter also included a gruesome postscript in which the writer claimed to have fried and eaten the missing kidney of Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper's victims. As the murders continued, the police became increasingly desperate to find a suspect. They interviewed dozens of witnesses and followed up on hundreds of leads, but the killer remained elusive. Despite the best efforts of Inspector Aberline and his team, Jack the Ripper was never caught. The last of the canonical 5 murders, that of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9, 1888, marked the end of the killing spree, but the identity of the killer remained a mystery. In the years that followed, countless theories and suspects emerged, but none were ever proven conclusively. Some experts have suggested that the Ripper may have been a member of the royal family, a prominent surgeon, or even a woman, but these theories have been largely dismissed as speculation. The failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper had a profound impact on the public perception of the Metropolitan Police. Many people, particularly those living in the East End, lost faith in the ability of the police to protect them from harm. As one contemporary newspaper put it, the police have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. They have failed to discover the perpetrator of the most horrible series of crimes that have ever disgraced a civilized country. The case also highlighted the deep social and economic divisions that existed in Victorian London, with many people believing that the police were more interested in protecting the wealthy and powerful than in solving crimes that affected the poor and marginalized. The shadowy suspects, unraveling the enigma of Jack the Ripper. In the foggy streets of London's East End, a sinister presence lurked in the autumn of 1888. Jack the Ripper, the notorious serial killer, left a trail of blood and terror in his wake, preying upon the vulnerable women of Whitechapel. Despite an extensive investigation by Scotland Yard, the Ripper's identity remained shrouded in mystery, spawning a myriad of theories and speculations that have endured for over a century. As the British Prime Minister at the time, Lord Salisbury, aptly put it, the most ghastly and mysterious series of crimes in modern times has been committed in the very heart of the metropolis. One of the most compelling suspects to emerge in the case was Montague John Druitt, a 31-year-old barrister and schoolmaster. Born in Wimborne Minster, Dorset, in 1857, Druitt was a well-educated man from a respectable family. However, beneath his genteel exterior, there were whispers of a troubled mind. In November 1888, just days after the brutal murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the last of the canonical 5 Ripper victims, Druitt was dismissed from his teaching position at a boarding school in Blackheath, southeast London. On December 31st, 1888, his lifeless body was found floating in the River Thames, near Chiswick, leading many to believe that he had taken his own life out of guilt or fear of being exposed as the Ripper. The evidence against Druitt was circumstantial at best, but some intriguing connections were made. His family had a history of mental illness, and Druitt himself was known to have suffered from bouts of depression and erratic behavior. Additionally, his movements around the time of the murders were suspicious, with some witnesses claiming to have seen him in Whitechapel on the nights in question. In 1959, author Daniel Farson published a book titled Jack the Ripper, in which he claimed that Druitt was the most likely suspect based on his background and the timing of his death. However, without any concrete proof, Druitt's involvement in the Ripper case remains purely speculative. Another suspect who has captured the imagination of Ripperologists is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel during the time of the murders. Born in 1865 in the Russian Empire, Kosminski fled to England in the early 1880s, settling in the heart of London's impoverished East End. He worked as a hairdresser and was known to have a history of mental instability and a deep-seated hatred of women. According to a report in the Jewish Chronicle from September 1888, the Whitechapel murders had created a feeling of terror among the local Jewish community, who feared being targeted by anti-Semitic violence in the wake of the crimes. Kosminski's name first surfaced in the Ripper investigation in 1894, when Sir Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, claimed in his memoirs that the killer had been identified as a low-class Polish Jew. Although Anderson did not directly name Kosminski, subsequent research has pointed to him as the likely suspect. In 1910, former Chief Inspector Donald Swanson made a handwritten note in the margin of his copy of Anderson's memoirs, stating that Kosminski had been identified by a witness as the Ripper, but the witness later refused to testify against him. Despite the compelling nature of the evidence against Kosminski, there are many who question his involvement in the crimes. Some argue that the police were biased against the Jewish community and were eager to pin the murders on a convenient scapegoat. Others point out that Kosminski was institutionalized in a mental asylum in 1891, 3 years after the Ripper murders had ceased, suggesting that he may not have been capable of committing the atrocities. In a curious twist, a shawl believed to have belonged to Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper's victims, was recently tested for DNA evidence and was found to contain traces of both Eddowes's and Kosminski's DNA. However, the reliability of this evidence has been disputed by many experts. One of the more controversial theories surrounding the Jack the Ripper case involves the artist Walter Sickert, a prominent figure in the British avant-garde movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Born in Munich in 1860, Sickert spent much of his childhood in England and later studied under the renowned painter James Abbott McNeill Whistler. He was known for his gritty, realist paintings of working-class life in London, often depicting the seedy underbelly of the city's music halls and brothels. Sickert's fascination with the darker aspects of human nature led him to rent a room in Whitechapel in the late 1880s, just a stone's throw from where the Ripper murders took place. The theory that Sickert was Jack the Ripper first gained traction in the 1970s, when author Stephen Knight published his book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution. Knight claimed that Sickert had been part of a conspiracy involving the British royal family, and that the murders were an attempt to cover up a scandalous secret. According to Knight, Sickert had been hired to procure ladies of the night for Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, who had allegedly fathered an illegitimate child with one of the women. When the story threatened to become public, the royal family supposedly ordered the murders to silence the witnesses and protect their reputation. While Knight's theory was later discredited, the idea that Sickert was somehow involved in the Ripper murders has persisted. In 2002, crime novelist Patricia Cornwell published a book called Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed, in which she claimed to have uncovered new evidence linking Sickert to the crimes. Cornwell spent millions of dollars investigating the case, even purchasing Sickert's desk and subjecting it to DNA analysis in the hopes of finding a match with the Ripper's letters. She also pointed to similarities between Sickert's paintings and the Ripper's crimes, such as the use of a specific type of knot in the victim's mutilations that resembled a knot used in one of Sickert's works. Despite Cornwell's efforts, the evidence against Sickert remains largely circumstantial. While he was known to have a fascination with the Ripper murders and even painted a series of works inspired by the case, there is no concrete proof that he was the killer. Some experts have dismissed the theory outright, arguing that Sickert's artistic interest in the murders was simply a reflection of the cultural obsession with the case at the time. As Sickert himself once said, "The mysterious always has a morbid attraction, and the uncatchable criminal is, of course, a figure to capture the imagination." As the years have passed, countless other suspects and theories have emerged in the Jack the Ripper case. Some have pointed the finger at royal physician Sir William Gull, suggesting that he was tasked with silencing the victims to protect the reputation of the royal family. Others have suggested that the killer may have been a woman, such as the midwife Mary Piercy, who was convicted of a similarly gruesome murder in 1890, or even Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor himself, who was rumoured to have visited ladies of the night in Whitechapel. One of the most intriguing theories involves a man known as James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant who died in 1889 under suspicious circumstances. In 1992, a diary purportedly written by Maybrick surfaced, in which he confessed to being Jack the Ripper. The diary contained intimate details about the murders and even included a sketch of one of the victims. However, the authenticity of the diary has been hotly debated, with many experts dismissing it as a hoax. Despite countless investigations, theories and suspects, the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. The case has spawned an entire industry of Ripperology, with countless books, films and tours dedicated to exploring the various theories and suspects. In 2015, the Jack the Ripper Museum opened in Whitechapel, sparking controversy for its perceived exploitation of the victims' stories. In 2019, a team of researchers claimed to have identified the killer as Aaron Kosminski, based on DNA evidence found on a shawl belonging to one of the victims. However, the claim has been met with skepticism by many experts, who argue that the evidence is inconclusive and that the true identity of Jack the Ripper may never be known. As Ripperologist Paul Begg put it in a 2019 interview with The Guardian, "I don't think we'll ever know for certain who Jack the Ripper was. The evidence is too fragmentary, too contradictory, and too unreliable." Chilling correspondence, dissecting the infamous letters of Jack the Ripper. Amidst the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel, a series of brutal murders in 1888 sent shockwaves through Victorian London. The elusive killer, known as Jack the Ripper, not only terrorized the East End with his heinous acts, but also taunted the authorities and the public through a chilling correspondence. These letters, purportedly written by the Ripper himself, added an extra layer of mystery and intrigue to an already sensational case that captivated the nation. As Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon who examined the victims, observed, "The murderer must have been a man of physical strength and of great coolness and daring. There is no evidence that he had an accomplice." One of the most infamous letters associated with the Ripper case is the "Dear Boss" letter, which was received by the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. The letter, written in red ink and postmarked from London's East End, began with the salutation, "Dear Boss," and was signed Jack the Ripper, marking the first time the killer's notorious nickname appeared in print. The letter's author claimed responsibility for the murders and threatened to continue his bloody work, stating, "I am down on ladies of the night, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled." The letter also contained a disturbing postscript. "Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance." The authenticity of the Dear Boss letter has been the subject of much debate among Ripperologists. Some experts believe that the letter was a genuine communication from the killer, citing its graphic content and insider knowledge of the crimes. Others, however, dismiss it as a hoax, possibly penned by a journalist seeking to sensationalize the case. The handwriting in the letter was also compared to that of journalist Thomas Bulling, who worked for the Central News Agency at the time, leading some to speculate that he may have been the true author. In fact, the police received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the Ripper, most of which were considered hoaxes. Chief Inspector John Littlechild of the Metropolitan Police famously stated, "I am afraid that a great many of the letters sent to the police were written by fools who wanted to be thought the murderer, and who in some cases succeeded in getting themselves locked up." Just 2 days after the Dear Boss letter was received, another disturbing missive arrived at the Central News Agency. The Saucy Jackie postcard, postmarked on October 1st, 1888, taunted the police for their inability to catch the killer and hinted at the gruesome nature of the crimes. The postcard, written in a similar tone to the Dear Boss letter, included the chilling line, "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event this time." The postcard also featured a small sketch of a knife, adding to its menacing quality. Tragically, the double event mentioned in the postcard came to pass on September 30th, 1888, when the bodies of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were discovered in Whitechapel, mere hours apart. The Stride murder, which took place on Berner Street, now Henriquez Street, was interrupted by the arrival of a cart driver named Israel Schwartz, causing the killer to flee before he could complete his grisly task. Eddowes, on the other hand, was not so fortunate. Her badly mutilated body was found in Mitre Square, with her left kidney and a portion of her uterus removed by the killer. The precision of the cuts led many to believe that the Ripper possessed surgical skill. As Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, who conducted the autopsy on Eddowes, noted, "The murder was evidently committed by a demented being of the Jack the Ripper type. The regularity and skill with which it was perpetrated pointed to a practiced hand in this class of crime." The Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard were not the only unsettling communications attributed to the Ripper. Perhaps the most disturbing of all was the From Hell letter, which was accompanied by a small box containing half of a human kidney. The letter, received by George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, on October 16, 1888, claimed that the kidney belonged to Catherine Eddowes and that the killer had fried and ate the other half. The letter was postmarked London E, indicating that it had been sent from the city's East End. The From Hell letter, with its horrifying contents and mocking tone, sent a chill through the already frightened residents of Whitechapel. The letter's authenticity, like that of the other Ripper correspondence, has been questioned over the years. Some experts suggest that the kidney may have been obtained from a medical specimen and planted as a sick joke, while others believe that only the true killer could have had access to such a grisly trophy. The kidney was examined by Dr. Thomas Openshaw of the London Hospital, who confirmed that it was human and belonged to a woman of around 45 years of age, consistent with Eddowes' profile. The impact of these letters on the Ripper investigation cannot be overstated. They fueled public fascination with the case and put immense pressure on the police to apprehend the killer. The taunting nature of the correspondence also suggested that the Ripper was not only brutal, but also intelligent and cunning, able to evade capture despite the best efforts of Scotland Yard. The press played a significant role in sensationalizing the case, with newspapers like The Times, The Daily Telegraph, and The Star dedicating extensive coverage to the murders and the ensuing investigation. The letters also provided tantalizing clues about the killer's identity and motivations, although many of these clues ultimately led to dead ends. For example, the Dear Boss letter's reference to being down on ladies of the night suggested that the killer may have had a deep-seated hatred of women, particularly those engaged in that line of work. This theory was further supported by the fact that all of the Ripper's known victims were women who worked as ladies of the night in the impoverished streets of Whitechapel. Other clues gleaned from the letters proved to be more enigmatic. The Saucy Jackie postcard's mention of a double event led some to speculate that the killer may have had inside knowledge of the police investigation, or even that he was a member of the force himself. This theory gained traction when it was revealed that one of the suspects, a Metropolitan Police officer named Thomas Cutbush, had been institutionalized in an insane asylum in 1891 for attacking women with a knife. However, Cutbush was later cleared of any involvement in the Ripper murders. The "From Hell" letters claim of having eaten half of Eddowes's kidney, while gruesome, also hinted at a possible medical background for the killer, given the precision with which the organ was removed. This led to suspicions falling on various doctors and surgeons who lived or worked in the Whitechapel area, such as Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack who had been arrested for gross indecency and was known to have a collection of uteruses in jars. Another suspect was Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a Scottish-Canadian doctor who was hanged in 1892 for poisoning several ladies of the night. However, neither Tumblety nor Cream was ever conclusively linked to the Ripper murders. Screaming headlines: how the media fanned the flames of fear in the Jack the Ripper case. In the autumn of 1888, the streets of London's East End were gripped by terror as a series of brutal murders captured the attention of the entire nation. The killer, who would come to be known as Jack the Ripper, left a trail of blood and mystery in his wake, sparking a media frenzy that would shape public perception and fuel widespread panic. As the bodies were discovered in the dark alleys of Whitechapel, the press descended upon the scene, eager to satisfy the public's insatiable appetite for news about the gruesome crimes. In the words of journalist W.T. Stead, the murders in Whitechapel have been a godsend to the newspapers. The media coverage of the Jack the Ripper case was a defining moment in the history of sensationalist journalism. Newspapers like The Times, The Daily Telegraph, and The Star competed to provide the most lurid and shocking details of the murders, often prioritizing speculation and rumor over factual reporting. Headlines screamed of Leather Apron, a mysterious figure initially suspected of the crimes, and Jack the Ripper, the moniker given to the killer by a letter purportedly written by the murderer himself. The press's obsession with the case was so intense that at one point, journalists outnumbered police officers at the crime scenes. As the Star reported on October 1, 1888, the newspaper men have been very much more numerous than the policemen, and they have certainly shown quite as much energy and ability in getting information. One of the most notorious examples of sensationalist journalism during the Ripper case was the Dear Boss letter, which was received by the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. The letter, signed Jack the Ripper, taunted the police and claimed responsibility for the murders. It was immediately seized upon by the press, who published it in full, along with lurid commentary and speculation about the killer's identity. The letter's authenticity was highly questionable, but that did not stop newspapers from treating it as a genuine communication from the murderer, fueling public fear and fascination with the case. The media's coverage of the Ripper murders was not limited to the news pages. The case also inspired a flood of commentary, opinion pieces, and even fiction. In October 1888, the Pall Mall Gazette published an article titled "What We Think of the Whitechapel Murders," which included a series of interviews with prominent figures such as the Bishop of Bedford and the head of the Salvation Army. The article was a sensation, with the Star reporting that the whole of London was talking about it. Other publications, such as the Illustrated Police News, featured ghoulish illustrations of the crime scenes and speculative portraits of the killer, further fueling the public's morbid curiosity. The News of the World even offered a £100 reward, equivalent to around £12,000 today, for information leading to the killer's capture. The media's sensationalist approach to the Ripper case had a profound impact on public perception and behavior. The East End, already a poor and overcrowded area, became the focus of intense scrutiny and fear. Women, particularly those who worked as ladies of the night, were afraid to walk the streets at night, and there were reports of vigilante groups patrolling the area in search of the killer. The panic reached such a fever pitch that, on September 8, 1888, a mob of angry residents attacked a man named John Peitzer, a local Jewish bootmaker, who they believed to be the Ripper, nearly beating him to death before the police intervened. Peitzer, who was known by the nickname Leather Apron, had been named as a suspect in the press, despite a lack of evidence linking him to the crimes. The police, meanwhile, struggled to keep up with the flood of tips and theories that poured in from the public and the press. Many of these were fueled by the media's speculation and rumor-mongering, leading to a series of false leads and dead ends. One of the most infamous examples was the leather apron theory, which suggested that the killer was a local butcher or slaughterman who wore a leather apron. The theory was based on little more than hearsay and speculation, but it dominated the headlines for weeks, leading to the questioning of dozens of innocent men. Another theory, put forth by the Star, suggested that the killer was a doctor or surgeon, based on the precision of the mutilations inflicted on the victims. This theory led to suspicion falling on a number of local medical professionals, including Dr. Thomas Barnardo, the founder of a charity for homeless children, who was briefly questioned by police. The media's role in shaping public perception of the Ripper case was not limited to the immediate aftermath of the murders. In the years and decades that followed, the case became a cultural touchstone, inspiring countless books, films, and television shows. Many of these works, such as Marie Belloc Lowndes' 1913 novel The Lodger, which was later adapted into a film by Alfred Hitchcock, drew heavily on the sensationalist journalism of the time, blurring the lines between fact and fiction. The case also spawned a cottage industry of ripperologists, amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts who continue to pore over the evidence and debate the killer's identity to this day. In 1888, the Metropolitan Police created the Criminal Investigation Department, a specialized unit tasked with investigating serious crimes like murder. The case also led to increased scrutiny of the East End's notorious common lodging houses, which were breeding grounds for crime and disease. The police also introduced the use of bloodhounds to track suspects, although the dogs proved to be largely ineffective in the densely populated streets of Whitechapel. The press's obsession with the case also had a darker side, as some newspapers used the murders as an excuse to stoke anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant sentiment. The East End was home to a large Jewish population, and some newspapers, such as the East London Observer, suggested that the killer was a low-class Jew. From grisly reality to enduring legend, the timeless allure of Jack the Ripper in popular culture. The Ripper's influence on popular culture began almost immediately after the murders, with the publication of numerous books and pamphlets purporting to offer insight into the case. One of the earliest and most famous of these was The Complete Jack the Ripper by Alexander Pedachenko, published in 1908. The book, which claimed to be based on exclusive information from a Russian secret agent, was later exposed as a hoax, but it set the tone for much of the sensationalist and speculative writing that would follow. Another early example was Jack the Ripper, or When London Walked in Terror, by Leonard Matters, published in 1929, which claimed to have identified the killer as a Polish Jewish hairdresser named Aaron Kosminski, a theory that would be revived many years later. As the writer and Ripper enthusiast Richard Jones put it, the Ripper has become a cipher, a blank canvas onto which we can project our own fears and obsessions. As the 20th century progressed, the Ripper's legacy continued to grow, fueled in part by the emergence of new media formats like film and television. In 1927, Alfred Hitchcock directed The Lodger, a story of the London fog, a silent film loosely based on the Ripper case. The film, which starred Ivor Novello as a mysterious tenant who may or may not be the killer, established many of the tropes that would come to define Ripper-inspired fiction, including the idea of the killer as a shadowy, enigmatic figure. Hitchcock would return to the Ripper theme in his 1972 film Frenzy, which featured a serial killer who strangled his victims with a necktie, a nod to the Ripper's supposed habit of strangling his victims before mutilating them. In the decades that followed, the Ripper would become a staple of horror and suspense fiction, appearing in countless books, films, and television shows. One of the most influential of these was Marie Belloc Lowndes' 1913 novel, The Lodger, which inspired numerous film adaptations, including Hitchcock's. The novel, which centers on a London landlady who suspects her tenant may be the Ripper, helped to establish the idea of the killer as a figure of fear and fascination, a symbol of the dark underbelly of Victorian society. Another notable example was the 1979 film Murder by Decree, which starred Christopher Plummer as Sherlock Holmes and James Mason as Dr. Watson, and posited a conspiracy theory involving the British royal family and Freemasonry. The Ripper's influence can also be seen in the development of the detective fiction genre, which emerged in the wake of the murders. Many of the earliest examples of the genre, such as Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, were inspired in part by the Ripper case, with their emphasis on the use of forensic evidence and deductive reasoning to solve seemingly impossible crimes. In fact, Doyle himself was briefly considered a suspect in the Ripper case due to his medical background and his apparent knowledge of the East End. The Ripper's legacy can also be seen in the work of later crime writers, such as Patricia Cornwell, whose 2002 book, Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed, claimed to have definitively identified the killer as the British painter Walter Sickert, based on DNA evidence and other clues. In addition to his influence on fiction, the Ripper has also had a profound impact on the field of criminology. The case was one of the first to use forensic evidence like fingerprints and blood analysis, and it helped to establish many of the modern techniques used in criminal investigations today. The case also helped to raise awareness of the social and economic conditions in London's East End, which were characterized by poverty, overcrowding, and a lack of basic services like sanitation and healthcare. In the words of the social reformer William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, the horrors of the Whitechapel murders have at last forced society to face the facts. The murders are but a symptom of the disease. The real evil lies deeper. Regardless of the truth behind the Ripper's identity, his legacy continues to loom large in popular culture. In recent years, there have been numerous books, films, and television shows that have explored the case from various angles, from the psychological thriller From Hell, 2001, based on the graphic novel by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell, to the more light-hearted Ripper Street, 2012 to 2016, which imagined a group of detectives in the East End in the years after the murders. The Ripper has even made appearances in video games, such as the Assassin's Creed series, which features a fictionalized version of the killer as a character in its 2015 game, Syndicate. And so, the shadowy figure of Jack the Ripper vanishes into the fog of history, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and chilling tales. From the alleys of Whitechapel to the hearts of detectives like Frederick Aberline, the enigma remains. As the author of The Complete History of Jack the Ripper, Philip Sugden once said, "The crimes remain a mystery because they touch upon the greatest mystery of all, the dark, unfathomable depths of the human soul." Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey through time. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and good night.